There comes a moment in life, quiet, almost invisible, when you realize that what you've been calling strength is actually slowly breaking you. No loud arguments, no dramatic endings, just a deep, unshakable exhaustion that settles in your chest. You keep showing up, keep giving, keep explaining yourself to people who were never truly listening, believing that staying makes you strong. But strength was never meant to feel like this. It was never meant to drain your soul, silence your voice, and make you question your own worth. And in that moment, when the noise fades and the truth becomes impossible to ignore, you begin to understand something powerful. Walking away is not surrender. It is not weakness. It is the quiet, deliberate decision to protect what little peace you have left before it disappears completely. There's a quiet deception many people live under for years, the belief that staying, no matter how painful it becomes, is a sign of strength. You endure conversations that leave you feeling smaller, tolerate behaviors that slowly chip away at your confidence, and convince yourself that patience will somehow transform what is clearly damaging. On the surface, it looks admirable. You appear composed, resilient, unshaken, but beneath that surface, something else is happening, something far more costly. What often goes unnoticed is how this constant endurance begins to reshape you. It's not immediate. It doesn't happen in one dramatic moment. It's gradual, subtle, almost unrecognizable at first. You start adjusting your tone, your reactions, your boundaries, just to keep the peace. You silence parts of yourself, not because they are wrong, but because expressing them feels exhausting. Over time, you become someone who is always accommodating, always understanding, always giving more than you receive, and eventually, you forget what it felt like to simply exist without carrying the emotional weight of others. The illusion lies in thinking that this is strength, that absorbing discomfort without resistance is a form of power. But true strength was never meant to look like silent suffering. It was never meant to require you to shrink yourself just to fit into spaces that cannot hold you properly. What you've been calling strength might actually be fear. Fear of change, fear of being misunderstood, fear of standing alone, and fear has a way of disguising itself as loyalty, as patience, as resilience. There is also a certain identity people build around this endurance. You begin to see yourself as the one who stays, the one who doesn't give up, the one who can handle more than others. It becomes part of how you define your worth. Walking away then feels like losing a part of who you are. It feels like failure. But what if that identity was never meant to be permanent? What if it was simply a survival role you stepped into, not a life you were meant to live forever? At some point, a realization begins to form, quietly, almost like a whisper you try to ignore. You start to notice how heavy everything feels, how conversations drain you instead of energizing you, how being around certain people requires more effort than it should. And in that awareness, a truth emerges. Staying is no longer serving you. It is not making you stronger. It is slowly wearing you down. The hardest part is accepting that leaving doesn't erase the time, the effort, or the care you invested. It doesn't mean those things were meaningless. It simply means that their purpose has been fulfilled, and continuing beyond that point comes at too high a cost. Strength in its truest form is not about how much you can, about knowing when to stop. And that moment, when you finally see the difference, when you recognize that staying has become self-betrayal rather than resilience, that is where real strength begins. Not in enduring endlessly, but in having the courage to choose yourself, even when it feels unfamiliar, even when it feels difficult. Every human being moves through spaces that carry invisible weight. Some places feel light, as if your thoughts can breathe freely there. Others feel heavy, even when nothing is being said directly. You enter them thinking you can manage it, that you can adapt, that your presence alone can soften what feels uncomfortable. But over time, you begin to notice something unsettling. You are not just visiting these spaces, you are absorbing them. Emotional environments are not neutral. They shape the way you think, react, and even see yourself. When you remain in an atmosphere that constantly demands explanation, defense, or emotional restraint, your inner world starts to adjust itself. You become more careful with your words, more hesitant with your truth, more aware of how everything might be received rather than how it actually feels. Slowly, you begin to live externally instead of internally. Your energy starts to revolve around managing reactions instead of expressing authenticity. What makes this even more complex is that it rarely feels dramatic. There is no single moment that signals danger. Instead, it is a gradual fading of clarity. You wake up one day and realize that your thoughts are not as sharp as they used to be. Your confidence feels slightly dimmed. Your emotional responses are slower, heavier, as if everything requires extra effort. Yet you keep telling yourself it is normal, that this is just life, that every connection requires compromise. But there is a difference between healthy compromise and emotional depletion. One expands you, the other shrinks you. One leaves you feeling understood, even in disagreement. The other leaves you questioning your own perception perception, your own feelings, your own worth. And when you stay too long in the wrong environment, you stop noticing that difference altogether. You begin to normalize discomfort. This is how emotional exposure becomes dangerous, not because of one event, but because of repetition. You keep returning, keep engaging, keep hoping that things will shift. But in doing so, you slowly condition yourself to tolerate more than you should. You start adjusting your boundaries instead of enforcing them. You start explaining your emotions instead of honoring them. And little by little, your internal compass becomes quieter. At some point, you may even begin to believe that this heaviness is part of who you are, that you are someone who overthinks, who overfeels, who struggles with intensity. But often, it is not you that is the problem. It is the environment that is too loud for your peace, too chaotic for your clarity, too inconsistent for your stability. Walking away in this context is not about rejection or escape. It is about recognition. It is the moment you finally understand that your energy is not infinite and not every space deserves access to it. It is the decision to stop normalizing what consistently drains you, not out of anger, not out of reaction, but out of awareness. Because once you truly see how environments shape you, you can no longer pretend they don't. And in that awareness, something shifts internally. You stop asking how much you can tolerate and start asking what is actually sustainable for your peace. Walking away is one of the most misunderstood decisions a person can make. From the outside, it often appears simple, just a step forward, a change of direction, a quiet exit. But internally, it is far more complex. It is a moment where emotion, memory, loyalty, and self-respect collide. It is not a reaction, it is not an escape, it is a conscious recognition that continuing in a certain direction no longer aligns with your well-being. People are often taught that staying is noble, that endurance defines character, that the longer you tolerate something, the more strength you are showing. But this belief can become dangerous when it keeps you attached to situations that are no longer healthy for you. There comes a point where endurance stops being a virtue and starts becoming a pattern of self-neglect. You keep showing up, not because it is right for you, but because you have already invested time, emotion, and effort, and letting go feels like losing all of it. But what is often overlooked is that staying too long can cost more than leaving ever will. When you remain in environments or relationships that consistently drain your inner peace, you begin to adjust yourself to survive within them. You become quieter than you need to be, more forgiving than you should be, more patient than your own emotions can sustain. And without realizing it, you start to disappear from your own life, not physically, but emotionally, mentally, internally. Walking away interrupts that slow disappearance. It is the moment where you choose to stop adapting to discomfort and start responding to your own needs. It is not always loud or dramatic. In fact, it is often calm, almost silent, because real decisions of self-respect do not require noise. They require clarity, and clarity usually arrives after confusion has been endured long enough. One of the hardest parts of walking away is detaching from the emotional narrative you built around staying. You remember the good moments, you remember the hope, you remember what you believed things could become. And that memory can make leaving feel like betrayal, not of others, but of your own expectations. But there is an important truth hidden inside that struggle. Not everything that once felt meaningful is meant to continue forever. Growth often requires distance from what no longer supports it. And distance is not punishment, it is perspective. When you step away, you begin to see things without emotional distortion. You start noticing patterns instead of moments, repetition instead of change, effort without return. And in that clarity, something shifts inside you. You stop asking how to fix what keeps hurting you and start asking why you are still trying to hold on to it. Walking away is not about proving strength to others. It is about finally acknowledging your own limits without guilt. It is accepting that your peace has value, even if others do not understand it. It is realizing that you do not have to stay in order for your presence to matter. And sometimes your absence speaks more clearly than your endurance ever did. In the end, walking away is not an ending in the way people assume. It is a return to yourself, to your boundaries, to your emotional clarity. It is the quiet decision that says you are no longer willing to abandon your inner world just to remain in someone else's. Detachment is often misunderstood as coldness, as indifference, or as emotional absence. But in reality, true detachment is none of these things. It is not the absence of feeling, it is the mastery of it. It is the ability to care without being consumed, to observe without being entangled, and to understand without losing yourself in what you see. It is one of the quietest forms of strength a human being can develop. Most people begin life deeply attached to people, to expectations, to outcomes, to the idea of how things should be. This attachment is natural. It gives meaning, direction, and emotional connection. But when attachment becomes dependency on emotional validation or constant reassurance, it slowly turns into a source of instability. You begin to measure your worth through responses, reactions, and acceptance from others. And in doing so, your inner balance starts to depend on external behavior that you cannot control. This is where emotional turbulence begins. When your peace is tied to how others behave, you are no longer fully in charge of your internal world. A single shift in tone, a change in attitude, or a moment of distance from someone else can completely alter your emotional state. And over time, this creates exhaustion, not the kind of exhaustion that comes from physical effort, but the deeper kind that comes from emotional overinvestment. Detachment begins the moment you recognize this imbalance. It is not a rejection of people or relationships. It is a recalibration of your inner boundaries. You start to understand that not everything requires your reaction, not everything deserves your emotional energy, and most importantly, not everything is yours to fix, hold, or carry. There is a subtle power in observing without absorbing. When you are no longer pulled into every emotional wave around you, you begin to see things more clearly. You notice patterns instead of isolated moments. You recognize repetition instead of confusion. And slowly, clarity replaces chaos. You stop reacting from emotion alone and start responding from awareness. This shift changes everything. You no longer chase understanding from those who are unwilling to give it. You no longer over-explain your presence to those who only notice your absence when it is convenient. You no longer bend yourself into emotional shapes just to maintain connections that drain you. Instead, you begin to stand still within yourself, stable, aware, and less dependent on external validation. But detachment is not easy. It requires restraint. It requires the discipline to not react immediately, to not internalize every behavior, to not personalize every shift in energy around you. It also requires acceptance, the acceptance that you cannot control how others act, feel, or respond. You can only control how much of it you allow to enter your inner world. And that is where real freedom begins, not in isolation, not in avoidance, but in emotional independence. When you stop over-identifying with everything around you, you begin to reclaim something essential, your internal stillness. You no longer feel constantly pulled in different emotional directions. You are no longer scattered across other people's moods and expectations. Detachment, at its core, is not about distance from life. It is about depth within yourself. It allows you to stay present without being consumed, to care without collapsing, to love without losing clarity. And in that balance, you find something rare and powerful, a peace that does not depend on anything outside of you. What you allow repeatedly in your life does not remain external. It slowly becomes internal. Every environment you stay in, every dynamic you tolerate, every emotional pattern you normalize begins to shape the way you think, the way you respond, and eventually the way you see yourself. This is why protection of energy is not a luxury. It is not an emotional preference. It is a necessity for your future self. Many people imagine their future as something distant, something that will naturally improve with time. But the truth is, the future is built silently through present choices that often feel small. The way you respond to disrespect, the way you tolerate emotional imbalance, the way you keep explaining yourself in spaces where you are not truly heard. These are not isolated moments, they are patterns. And patterns shape identity. When you remain too long in environments that drain you, you begin to adapt to them, not consciously, but gradually. You start normalizing emotional exhaustion. You start accepting confusion as communication. You start mistaking inconsistency for depth. And slowly, your standards adjust, not upward, but downward. You stop asking whether something feels right for you and start asking whether you can endure it a little longer. This is how energy loss becomes identity loss. You don't just feel tired, you start becoming someone who is always tired. You don't just feel misunderstood, you start expecting misunderstanding. And over time, these internal shifts become so familiar that you no longer recognize them as external influence. They begin to feel like personality. But your energy was never meant to be scattered across everything that demands attention from you. It was meant to be directed, protected, and invested where it creates growth rather than depletion. Protecting it does not mean closing yourself off from people. It means becoming conscious of what enters your emotional space and what is allowed to stay there. There is a quiet strength in deciding that not everything deserves access to you. Not every conversation deserves your explanation. Not every situation deserves your emotional participation. And not every connection deserves your continued presence. This awareness is not harsh, it is clear, and clarity is what begins to restore your inner balance. Because when your energy is constantly leaked into places that do not value it, you slowly lose access to your own clarity. You begin to feel mentally scattered, emotionally heavy, and spiritually disconnected from yourself. And in that state, even simple decisions start to feel overwhelming. Not because you are incapable, but because you are depleted. Protecting your energy is in many ways protecting your direction in life. It ensures that your focus remains intact, that your emotions are not constantly hijacked by external chaos, that your thoughts are not permanently shaped by unstable environments. It allows you to build something consistent within yourself, even if everything outside you is inconsistent. And perhaps the most important realization is this: your future self will not remember every conversation, every situation, or every emotional struggle you face today, but it will absolutely reflect the environments you chose to remain in and the boundaries you chose to enforce or ignore. So, when you protect your energy, you are not just making a present decision, you are shaping a future identity, one that is grounded, aware, and no longer available for anything that quietly breaks it down.